From revitalized regional airports to large-scale vertiports for passenger missions to mass logistics hubs and community receptacles for cargo operations, a set of standards, requirements, and policy will need to be designed. Opportunity exists to integrate UAM infrastructure within the existing transportation structures in order to support multimodal mobility experiences. This panel will discuss design standards and requirements, relevant land use and zoning policy, as well as public-private financing mechanisms surrounding UAM infrastructure. It is my pleasure to introduce our next moderator, Dr. Amber Woodburn McNair. She is an assistant professor within the City and Regional Planning section of The Ohio State University's Knowlton School. She also holds a joint appointment with Ohio State's Center for Aviation Studies. At OSU, Dr. Woodburn McNair integrates air transportation planning in both her teaching and research with graduate and undergraduate students. She has written extensively on airport metro area planning and is interested in understanding how UAM will influence the built environment, social systems, and urban outcomes. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Amber Woodburn McNair.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here and see all of you. Thank you for joining us. I will be trying to get us off this stage by 3:30 because I have to go administer midterm. So if anybody wants to test their airport planning knowledge, you can come with me. No, you should stay here. All right, so we have a great group of panelists today to represent a few different points of view on infrastructure. So we have Rex Alexander, Infrastructure Advisor for the Vertical Flight Society. We have our local, Justin Anderson, who's a Senior Airport Planner with the Columbus Regional Airport Authority. We also have Lisa Peterson, President of Peterson Mobility Solutions. And then finally, at the far end, we have Danielle Rinsler, who is currently Head of Aviation Policy at Uber Elevate. So I'd like to give each panelist a moment to quickly introduce themselves, their organization, and how they're involved in aviation, and particularly urban air mobility. So we'll let you take it away, Rex.
Okay. Well, I wear lots and lots of hats. Right now, sitting on the stage, I'm the Vertical Flight Society's representative in infrastructure, represent our society in all things vertical lift, short of a balloon. So when we look at that, I spent most of my life in helicopters, helicopter pilot, airplane pilot, also an airframe and power plant mechanic. Started designing infrastructure about 20 years ago, military, offshore, and EMS. And somebody asked, how did you get into infrastructure? I said, there just became a point in my life that I just got this question. Why are architects and engineers out to kill me every time I try to turn around? And it was not that they're not good people, they just didn't know what they didn't know. So when we look at designing infrastructure, we have to pay attention to the three-dimensional piece, because the two-dimensional piece is the easy piece. It's the airspace that's a challenge. So in that space, I've been working in that space for a long time. I design heliports all around the world and now work for the Vertical Flight Society and represent their society's members and their interest to the FAA, ICAO, the DOT, fire protection, the whole 9 yards. So that's my thumbnail sketch today.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Justin Anderson. I'm the Senior Airport Planner for the Columbus Regional Airport Authority. So what I do is I oversee a lot of our forecasting development through our facilities. For those who don't know, the Columbus Regional Airport Authority, we are an airport authority that oversees John Glenn Columbus International Airport here. That's our commercial airport. We also oversee Rickenbacker International Airport, which is mainly our cargo airport down on the southeast side of the city. And then we also, we don't forget Bolton Field, which is our general aviation facility on the southeast side. So like I said, I'm a planner there. I'm responsible for developing our forecast, overseeing our facility development at all three airports. And in terms of UAM, we are always inviting to have new technology, new industries come into our facility, and we want to make sure that we can plan and design for those types of industries. I'll also act as a liaison between the airport authority and the FAA and making sure that we are in compliance with all FAA regulations, and then also with ODOT, the Ohio Department of Transportation. We work very closely with them too.
Hi, is this on? So Lisa Peterson, and I am with Peterson Mobility Solutions. I have to say that I am a late addition to the panel in that WSB was going to speak formally, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time talking to Adrienne Lincoln, who was going to be here, but a personal issue came up and she was not able to be here. So, but just to give WSB a little bit of a plug, they are a leading transportation, urban planning, advisory, and infrastructure firm. And as I said, I was talking to Adrian about some joint opportunities in terms of projects that we were pursuing. So let me talk a little bit about my background. So for the past 5 years, I've had the opportunity to work with high-tech technology companies, the most recent being Aeros, and I saw that Aeros is well on display here, and Aeros is under GE Aviation. So Aeros had come at it from a UTM perspective, airspace management perspective, but prior to that, I spent a lot of time in the world of data and analytics, and was looking at urban planning, smarter mobility through a city, smarter commerce through a city. And prior to that, I have a mobile background, meaning wireless communication. So they are all kind of fitting together here in this new world of new mobility. And what I have found is that high-tech companies talking to public sector doesn't always marry up so well. So I'm here to help bridge the gap in terms of how do high-tech companies come in and set up their new technologies in a city or a community, and vice versa. How do public sector agencies start to look and evaluate some of these new technologies? What is the framework that they have to do now?
Hi, I'm Danielle Rinsler. Is this one? You can hear me? Okay. I'm currently the head of aviation policy with Uber. I'm relatively new in this role. I joined Uber about 3 months ago from the Federal Aviation Administration, where I spent the last 9 years at FAA wearing many hats. So I worked previously with Sabrina in the unmanned aircraft system office.
Can you check your mic real quick?
Now it might be on. Yeah. I was thinking it didn't sound like it was on, but do you want me to start over? No, I'm with Uber. I spent the last many years with FAA wearing various hats. So I joined FAA after many years in the aviation industry, working primarily on the airport planning and development side. So my background is I actually started, I sort of feel like I've come full circle. I went to school for city and regional planning to be a transportation planner, urban transportation planner, and fell into airport planning very early in my career, working at Logan Airport on a new runway project, and sort of got the aviation bug, probably like many of you in this room, and have since spent the rest of my career in this industry, both working at the local and state level, as well as with FAA. So I would say my expertise is on the infrastructure side, on planning and environmental and airport finance. I've done a lot in the community engagement realm and airport land use compatibility. So I'm really intrigued about kind of what the future of urban air mobility in terms of what we can achieve and how we can work really to intersect with community planners and urban planners to make this a reality. There's a lot of issues that we have that I'm sure the panel will discuss today. My role at Uber is really cross-functional, so I'm working across our organization. It's like a small but mighty team at Uber. It's very interesting. It's one of those big bets. I appreciated that John came full circle in his remarks earlier. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel when he started with the hype curve, but was grateful that he complimented Mark Moore at Uber. I think the interesting thing for me about Uber was that I was working at FAA on unmanned aircraft system integration issues for a number of years with Sabrina and many other folks in the industry. And never did we talk about urban air mobility. So, this was not something on the horizon at FAA even 3 years ago. So it's fascinating to me how much, and I want to give a big shout out to the NASA folks. I think it's amazing how much research work is happening now in this space and how much effort is going in from NASA in collaboration with FAA to really advance this sector. So anyhow, a lot more to talk about today, but that's my intro.
Great, thank you. So our first sort of batch of questions are going to be focused on this service context for what does the infrastructure need to accomplish. And then the second batch of questions are going to focus a bit more on like what does it mean to plan this infrastructure in a community. So we'll do some of the physical and digital conversation and then like the social science human factor side of the conversation. So first for Danielle. So as we've talked about already today, a lot of the things that distinguish urban air mobility service as different from conventional aviation services is that it's going to focus on providing, regional and urban scale mobility solutions that translates to shorter and more frequent trips. So there are other transportation innovations that are emerging on the surface that might compete for that same trip ride share. So how is Uber Elevate thinking about integrating urban air mobility services as part of a multimodal, technologically advancing infrastructure system?
Yeah, I think one of the things that drew me to Uber was this focus on relieving urban congestion, and then if for any of you are in a city like Washington D.C. where I live, or the Bay Area where I used to live, the urban congestion is just getting really just worse and worse, and even with transit solutions that we have today, it's not improving, and we're not seeing transit ridership increasing. And I think Uber's very cognizant, I think Lyft is as well, about the role of transportation network companies and potential, and there's been many recent studies on that are the TNCs contributing to congestion. So thinking about what can we do to change that, to really improve urban environments and mobility within these environments. So I think the interesting thing to me is we have a lot of power with this platform. We touch a lot of people, and we're able to move people really efficiently on the Uber platform. So how can we leverage that to improve congestion? So we're doing a number of things today that outside of even urban air mobility, because we're a few years from really having vehicles that we can use to advance our vision for eVTOL services. But in the near term, what can we do? So we're doing a lot of things with transit operators to connect folks through the platform to transit. So if you're going, in fact, I went from SFO to downtown San Francisco recently, and instead of taking an Uber, which was over an hour hour and 15 minutes, I think, to my hotel during rush hour, I looked at the app and was able just to know that going to BART was going to be much more efficient for me, and I got downtown in 25 minutes. So I think that's one of the powerful things that impressed me about Uber and continues to impress me. We're partnering with a number of transit agencies to provide accessible vehicles to improve mobility for people who otherwise would have to wait for a long time for an accessible vehicle. So there's a number of things that we're doing with the platform, the ability to, in the future, leverage the platform to provide this multimodal aerial ride-sharing service. So the idea is really not to, is to replace car trips, but to do so in a way where we'll be batching folks who would otherwise be driving on a congested route. We can now take people their first and last mile and pool them on a vehicle, on an air vehicle, and bring them to a destination without contributing to urban congestion. So we'll talk more about it, but I think that's the vision of Uber, is how can we move people more efficiently and reduce congestion on our roadways.
Yeah, and I think that integrates really well with some of the conversations we've already seen with, how do we think about aviation and maybe earlier just in the context of high-speed rail? Like, are we thinking about urban air mobility as a complementary service inside of an existing transportation system, or are we strictly trying to push it as a competitive service that's going to capture mode share instead of working with enhancing the existing system? So I thought that batched multimodal way of thinking was a newer narrative that I thought was good to share. So transitioning a bit to existing airport context, the way we think context and the way we think about what does the word infrastructure mean, right? It's not just the airfield, it's not just where we land and take off. It's a large system of things that we need to move passengers, cargo, and all the supporting services through a facility. So restrooms, retail tenants, passenger security, vehicle staging. So Justin, in your tremendous experience working with different types of airport facilities. What components of infrastructure do you think are going to be really important for UAM facility planners to consider?
Yeah, so a good thing about here in Columbus is, and I know today we spoke a lot about how the airspace is going to work and going to be able to accommodate this type of mobility, but what's good here in Columbus locally is that we don't really have a congested airspace problem, unlike the New York airspace or the Bay Area out West Coast. However, we look, when we do our master planning, we do look at the airspace, we look at the airfield infrastructure, which similar to the airspace here in Columbus, both Rickenbacker and Columbus and John Glenn Columbus, we have sufficient runway and taxiway capacity to handle additional cargo, passenger capacity. But we also look at, where can we park these aircraft or these vehicles, these VTOL vehicles, if they were to come to Columbus. And I think a big component of this is incorporating this into our master planning process, forecasting the activity of what this is going to look like, what type of market it is, if it's going to be passenger, if it's going to be cargo, and then also designing and coming up with concepts of how the facilities are going to be able to accommodate this. Now, we talked a little bit about security, so of course at an airport, maintaining that the TSA regulations are going to want to accommodate that if we do accommodate passengers at airports, and we have these VTOL vehicles coming in, we want to make sure that those passengers and cargo activity are screened properly. Another thing too is, where are we going to maintain these vehicles? Are they going to be at existing maintenance hangars, or do we have to take them off site? And if they're going to be at airports, we got to make sure that we can accommodate for the building of those facilities. Another thing too is operational planning, like I said. So when we're designing these landing pads, are we going to design them to heliport design standards, where they have the final approach takeoff area and the airspace that comes with heliports, or our VTOL surfaces or airspace surfaces that we have to protect, are they going to be specific to VTOL vehicles? So as airports, we are required to maintain, or to, as the best of our ability, keep clear our airspace surfaces. So how, with the introduction of VTOL vehicles, how are we going to be able to, how is that going to impact that?
So this is a special question now for, I think, from panel number 1, Jonathan Hartman made a point that Rex needed a tough question. Well, this is your tough question. So heliports represent perhaps the closest existing analog to vertiport infrastructure. Given the potential differences in performance characteristics between helicopters and the eVTOL aircraft, what may be fundamentally different about the infrastructure services that are required to support a vertiport? And is there enough similarity in current standards that we could repurpose heliports and other general aviation facilities to serve eVTOL? And then I encourage the other panelists to chime in as well after Rex. This is a very rich, very specific infrastructure conversation.
So I'd asked this question to one of my really good friends in the FAA. So what's the difference, you think, between heliports and vertiports? And he really quickly said, well, they're pretty much the same. Then he thought about it and said, but they're different. I said, well, you're no help whatsoever. But when we look at what we use today for helicopters and heliports, we base that on research and development that was conducted back in the 80s with aircraft that were built in the 70s based on performance criteria that was probably derived from technology in the 50s and 60s. We haven't done anything since then to change that. So the standards that we use are somewhat performance-based, but the standards that we implement are very prescriptive. Now the FAA is shifting quite a bit to performance-based standards to fall more in line with ICAO. Wait to see how that works out. But when we work at how a heliport's designed, right now we look at the aircraft itself. So the overall length of the aircraft and the rotor diameter are the two primary dimensional criteria that we use in designing the physical heliport. You have 3 pieces to the heliport: the teal-off, the FADO, and the safety area. Touchdown, liftoff area, final approach and takeoff area, and safety area. Those are all derived from those dimensions. All right, what are we going to use for these aircraft? I've seen 250 different concepts of every imaginable degree. The problem we run into is a helicopter is a helicopter is a helicopter 99% of the time. Not so in this new industry. So that's one of the first questions we have to figure out. What are we designing to, And do we have to come up with different categorizations similar to what ICAO uses today? Now, when we look at the performance, we don't have any values. And that's the first question I asked the FAA Airports Division when Mike Hirschberg, the executive director, and I went and visited them on behalf of the Vertical Flight Society. What are you going to make this look like for your advisory circular on vertiports? Well, we're not going to design anything until we have performance data. We don't have any aircraft yet. We don't have any performance data. So it's the chicken and egg theory, basically. So we're working really heavily in that space, trying to spearhead that process with the Vertical Flight Society being kind of the matchmaker, if you will, between the FAA Tech Center out of Atlantic City, and NASA Grand Challenge and their group. Try and come up with performance data that we can at least have a starting point. Now, there's 3 layers of oversight we deal with in the United States, and we go from the easy to the hard. Easy is the Federal Aviation Administration. You get a checklist. Follow the checklist, you're good to go. They're going to come out, they're going to do an airspace study, and they're going to give you a determination. Now, they don't certify, they don't license, they just give you a determination. They may come in and say, hey, you did a great job, here's your airspace determination. They may come in and say, hey, I don't know what you've been smoking, and this is the most unsafe thing we've ever seen. Here's your airspace determination, because they have no authority to say no. The FAA does not have any authority or oversight over private facilities. So then we get to the next level is state. There's 50 different ways of doing business. And that's one of our challenges on the second level. Every state's different. There is no common denominator. So what works in Indiana doesn't work in Ohio. What works in Ohio doesn't work in Illinois. And if you try to do that in California, they'll run you out on a rail because they're really picky. But the hardest nut to crack is the municipality at the local level, because that's where we get into ordinances, conditional use permits, fire code, building code. What fire code did you adopt? Oh, we adopted 1998 and we haven't updated since. Okay, that's wonderful news. Or we adopted the latest and greatest, but we also adopted NFPA, and that's a whole nother discussion. When we look at the conditional use permit, do you have one? That's where I work a lot right now in the heliport world. Do you actually have an ordinance that speaks to heliports? And there's a lot of places that don't. But here's the kicker. Nowhere in any of those codes, fire protection, building code, does it say the word vertiport. We don't know what that is. So how do you build something there's no standard to? Most municipalities are going to look, open their book, nope, can't do it. So we have to come up with that first in the code, in the municipality, and the key there is trying to get something that's standardized with commonality across all municipalities and the states. That's a tough one. The Vertical Flight Society's got a workshop coming up in March, 2 days. This is our second one. And that's one of the key things we're working on with the FAA, state. There's a group out there, NASAO, National Association of State Aviation Organizations, represents all 50 states. I sit on the NFPA 418 heliport design standards for Vertical Flight Society, and I get to go to Montreal in the winter and brief ICAO next month on how to spell UAM, basically. That's where we're at with them right now. And in that space, somebody had brought up the numbers, and that's a challenge. So there's 19,000 plus airports in the United States. Now, when you look at that, that's broken down: airports, heliports, balloon bases, seaplane bases, glider ports, everything's in that. Roughly 5,869 are heliports. There's at least 2,000 in the United States and doing the research that aren't accounted for in the 5010 Airport Master Record database. Now, I'm sorry, and I hate to be bad news, but I did a deep dive because I did a lecture in Ohio about 1.5 years ago in September in 2018. There are 127 airports missing in the database. They're either I can't find them, they're no longer there, or they're so wrong that they're like at least 5 miles in the wrong direction. Now, there's 44 hospitals in the state of Ohio with active heliports that don't show up in any database. You could fly right by it, it won't show up in your GPS because it's not there. You come off the loop going on that 33 corridor, that first hospital you come to, it's not in the database. There's an EMS base run by MedFlight of Ohio in Marysville that's not in the database, 24/7 EMS operation. How do you avoid something that you don't know exists if you're autonomous and it's not in the database? So when we get into the oversight and the integrity piece, that's going to be a big nut to crack. Right now, the FAA is light years behind in tracking information. Still paper to some degree. The airport master record is extremely airport-centric. When we look at the split on airports versus heliports, and we're looking at vertiports down the road, public versus private, that's the two areas we have. There's public owned, public use, private owned, private use. Out of the airport world, it's 65-90 or 65-35 split. 65 private, 35 public. In the heliport world, it's 1-99. There's 60 public use heliports in the US. Now, who has oversight? The FAA doesn't have any oversight over public, period. So you can be doing everything completely wrong and they can't do anything. It's only at the state level can they do anything, and only if they've been in legislation. It's the municipality level that may or may not have any. So what do we call vertiports? Are they public, are they private, or is something else? The case is being made right now, and I saw some legislation coming through the pipeline from the DOT here in Ohio, adding a third case, commercial. I agree with commercial because that's what it is. It's not public, it's not private. But if you use AIP funding, grant funding, now you have to abide by certain regulations. AIP funding or grant funding comes with assurances that you're abiding, and then the laundry list is astronomical. How many heliports in the United States have ever used AIP funding? That was the question. I did the research. There's one. So there's one heliport in the entire U.S. that the FAA can actually walk in and say, hey, you have to do this or we're going to shut you down. The other 5,800 and plus, they don't have a leg to stand on. So those are some of the things where we're looking at how do we get our hands around this. And we're working with the FAA. We're pushing pretty hard with legislation in Congress, and the National Academies of Sciences just came out with a white paper that talks to some of this. But there's a lot to be done. Somebody in DC asked me where are we at? And I said, we're about 2.5 years behind on the policy. I said, technology is outpacing us like tortoise and hare.
So, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I know we want to get to Lisa's question. I'll just say, like, we're operating a copter service out of the Part 139 heliport in the U.S. in downtown Manhattan heliport. And I think there's an opportunity here, too. So I think the reality is we do have a lot of airports in the United States that are underutilized as well, within the numbers that Rex is citing. And I think in my prior role at FAA, I worked on a study of the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, an asset study that really looked at how we were how the FAA at least categorizes airports for funding and other purposes. And I think there's a real opportunity here, right, to start to think about how we're using the system and opportunities for even, Bolton Field, right? So for some of the airports, thinking about what are the opportunities for some of the airports in the system that aren't well utilized today? They don't have a strong enough revenue base to really do meaningful service and to help relieve congestion or to even just help move people even in rural areas. So I think there's lots of use cases. We've been, obviously Uber specifically thinking about passenger movement in the very limited range of electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So we're really talking in the 20 to 60 mile radius, but there are many other potential use cases and opportunities that we heard about earlier. So just to add to.
So I can just kind of chime in, and we know what the next question is. So I have had the opportunity to talk to a number of different states in my last role, and the regional airport rejuvenation does come up quite a bit, and using existing infrastructure so we don't have to start everything from scratch again for urban air mobility makes some sense, but it is data driven. So I would just, going back to wearing my data hat now, This is all economic modeling, and in my last role before I was at Aeros, I was with a company that provided origination-destination trip demand for corridor planning for transportation organizations, and we were also looking at package delivery demand. Where are the packages going? How are they getting from point A to B? So there has to be the demand side part of the equation there too before we can just make these funding decisions. I know Uber obviously has a lot of that data. The cities and states may not be as empowered in terms of having that data to make those decisions. So I do think it is a combination of private and public really needing to work closely together. And also empowering the states and cities to have the right tools to even be able to evaluate back to, having some information that they can use, and no offense, not have it be Uber's data only, but have it be a neutral set of data that they can access, and asset management, having the right tools to manage the assets.
The data part, the interesting thing to me, looking at Uber has a whole simulation team that's doing market analysis and demand analysis, and it is fascinating, and they're combining not just rides data and data we have, but they're also getting broader data sets from other sources to really get the full picture. So it absolutely is data driven, and I think ultimately we'll have a limited number of aircraft in the early years to do looking at some key routes that make the most sense in terms of the platform and in terms of the objectives of congestion relief. But you're absolutely right.
A quick audience check-in, since we have a mixed group, and some of you might not have the infrastructure or finance background. Just quick raise of hands if you were familiar with the Airport Improvement Program. Yeah, so for those of you who this is new information, essentially this is how we think through the allocation of funding back out. This is sort of the same way we think about a gas tax. Money comes into the federal government and then it gets redistributed back out. So there's a formula that's used to decide based on the number of enplanements, how many passengers move through an airport facility, how much money you're sort of entitled to receive. And then there's a certain amount of discretionary money that can also be distributed for major projects. So thinking through this financing portion of, do we want urban air mobility facilities to piggyback off of what are already public facilities? Do we want to site plan brand new facilities that are privately owned? It comes with a lot of big questions about how that fits into our current financing mechanism, particularly at the national level. So as we kind of transition to Lisa's question, we have this system in place for public financing. What do we need to keep in mind? What are the implications of these choices and the way we choose to establish legislation and financial priorities when we're thinking through UAM facility ownership and financing?
Well, and I don't want to cause too much of a controversial debate here, but let me just talk about the different models. I think everyone knows, so we can get publicly funded models in to fund urban air mobility, but the challenge with the public infrastructure funding is that a lot of the funding goes to fixing things rather than putting the funding to new innovation. And then we are a free market type of society. We like competition and we like innovation. So, but then if we have the private sector completely fund all this and own the airways in the sky and the vertiports, takeoff landing places, does that mean that every private entity is going to set up their own, and that becomes not so efficient from a land use perspective and the air use perspective? So I do think the P3 model, having had some time spent with toll road operators in my former life, it seemed that, and let me just explain that model if people are not aware of how some of the private toll roads are being built. There are large investment backers and there are infrastructure engineering companies that are building the roads, and then there is usually a neutral type of entity that is private that is set up to run the system, the tolls, and basically be the collections of the revenue function and the management of the day-to-day. So could that model work for urban air mobility? Potentially. So there are these different models that have to be weighed, but in the end, private and public really need to be working hand in hand in lockstep on this.
Justin may have things to say response to this too. I think the reality in the U.S., at least from an aviation infrastructure standpoint, this may not, may have some applicability in the vertiport development space, but is that the airport improvement program is not growing. So it's been at, in the 3.2 billion or so range over the last many years. And interestingly, the passenger facility charge dollars are roughly the same. So the fact that our commercial airports in the system have another source of revenue to finance infrastructure. I most recently came from the Department of Transportation, where I worked on trying to expand a federal loan program called TIFIA into the airport space. So there's a unique opportunity there with the TIFIA, the Transportation Infrastructure Finance Improvement Act financing program, to leverage, basically leverage federal financing to build more and new infrastructure and take advantage of some of the opportunity there. It's just, unfortunately, today we don't have, it's not expanded to, so this is my plug for the TIFIA expansion to airports, since Lisa brought it up, but that's also an opportunity for public-private partnership, because TIFIA can lend both to public entities and to private entities. So not to take us too far afield, but I think there are some real opportunities on the infrastructure side to really think outside the box about how do we improve aviation facilities, how do we alter existing heliport facilities to accommodate urban air mobility, how do we, where, and then there's, the sky's the limit in terms of and maybe Justin and Rex and others can add to just sort of where lots of opportunities to use other types of infrastructure to potentially land these vehicles. So as we talked about earlier, thinking about, alternative landing areas to in emergency contingency situations, I think similarly, as we grow to some scale level of operations, there's other opportunities to use parking facilities and other types of facilities.
Can I add one more? We haven't really talked about this, but the public demand and the changes in mobility behaviors have been pretty significant over the past few years. So being able to forecast a 5, 10, 20 year, how do I fund this infrastructure? Again, it goes back to, well, what is the public demand showing, and how are those behaviors going to be factored into this decision making?
Yeah, and I think that understanding demand, right, is crucial and one of the hardest parts of this particular change in technology. But it kind of hints at this bigger issue with transportation planning in general, which is, on the one hand, we want to be able to forecast and respond to demand by providing the capacity and the services that we think will solve that problem. But we also have to reconcile what those infrastructure solutions cause in terms of those impacts, right? So we started thinking about noise and environmental impacts and the idea that we might be regionally benefiting society, but we still need to deal with those stakeholders at the local level, sometimes referred to as the not in my backyard, NIMBY kind of stakeholder groups. So it may be we can pivot, just since we don't have too much time left, to allow maybe Justin to start off with what it takes to consider noise monitoring and land use compatibility zoning to really engage with the local community as an airport. And then I know Rex has a great line about the news, and don't let them find out on the news. You better be the one to tell them. So I want you to talk about that, but let's start with Justin.
Yeah, so with the CRA, Columbus Regional Airport Authority, the CRAA, one of our strategic pillars is that we want to be as transparent as possible to the communities that we serve. And that we do that in our daily business. And one of the things right now is we're currently going through a noise compatibility study at John Glenn Columbus International Airport. And for those who don't know what that is, it's measuring the noise impacts that our airport produces on the local community. And it gives the community a chance to come in, learn what we do, learn our planning initiatives, and really understand the economic benefit that the airport has. Now, it can also be a process where it can't be a fun, sometimes it's not a fun process when you get local community members in and they get to voice their concerns, especially when the person isn't too keen on aviation and having aircraft fly over their house. With UAM and VTOL vehicles, how is that going to impact the local noise, and how is that going to impact the community's perception? I know throughout today, a big part of this has been, in order for this to be accepted, I know this is further down the road, but in order for this to be accepted, we have to have public acceptance. And I think a lot of that is being transparent. I know currently with the CRA, we have a noise monitoring system. We have a hotline that local community members and residents can call when they see an instance where it's not a normal operation, or if they have something flying over their house. I think it's important to carry that forward as we introduce when this type of industry gets introduced, and then also from the environmental standpoint too, is making sure that we are complying with NEPA requirements, and we are complying with all FAA environmental regulations as we plan for these facilities.
So, public opinion is formed at first contact. Be first. Don't allow your neighbors to find out about your heliport or vertiport project in the news that evening. Because guess what? They don't know anything about heliports, helicopters, vertiports, and vertiports. Where are they going to go to find out? Or they're going to go to the internet. Well, we know that the internet's 100% correct, right? When I get hired to come in and help you as a client, and the first thing I find out is your opposition has started a Facebook site against your heliport, you may have made the wrong turn at some point early on. So when we get into this, you want to be proactive. Have a marketing campaign, have a marketing and public relations team. Have your statistics ready. The number one things that we deal with every single time, safety is number one, noise is number two. Now we're getting into the, how's this impacting the environment? How's this impacting the wildlife? I now have to go to the wildlife strike group and ask them how many birds in the state of Minnesota have helicopters hit. Well, luckily we've only hit 7 since 1990. Now, there's 2,500 that have been hit, but only 7 have been hit by helicopters. Okay, that's pretty good. But yeah, that's what we get boiled down to. So being reactive in this space is going to get you in a lot of trouble. Be proactive. When you get into that NIMBY, the not in my backyard group, I have found out there's one other group other than helicopters and heliports that are disliked more. Substations. Guess what you're going to need for an electric aircraft? A substation. Do you know how much it costs to move electricity per mile? $1 million for power lines. When you put a substation in, it takes 2 years to plan, 2 years to permit. Most of the equipment that you need for a substation, it's on back order by 18 or 24 months. So you're talking a 5-year lead time before you even get started. And that doesn't include all the other stuff, the aviation piece. So these are some of those little components when you're dealing with the NIMBYs, and all of a sudden, hey, you can't put that substation in here. Now what are you going to do? Did you just spend money on that property? Somebody brought up the business case. I will tell you right now, there's a lot of heliports out there that will not make vertiports, ever. Heliports are a different business case. Heliports, you land an aircraft, offload, shut down, onload, take back off. Vertiports, you want a very significant throughput. Land, move to parking. Land, move to parking. Get in place, take back off. Most heliports are not designed with that thought process. They don't have the footprint physically to expand. Several don't even meet the standards that they were built under in the past. Then you don't have the airspace. So be very careful when you see a heliport. Hey, we'll buy that heliport. You may wind up having a really cool basketball court in the end. Do your due diligence.
Thank you. All right, so we are right at 3:30, but I want to ask one more question for Danielle and Lisa to consider. So we just addressed some of the importance of trying to behave like a good neighbor infrastructure provider, right? And we're not just here to serve a mobility mission. We're also here to interact with our neighbors. another important stakeholder group, right, are the actual urban planning professionals, like the community at state and local levels and even federal levels that need to build some proficiencies to be able to engage in this space. So maybe if you could each think of, one solid example of what you think can be done to productively close that gap that currently exists in the sort of technological awareness and capability of our current urban planning community.
Say Uber's already starting some of this work, and I think it's interesting. Is anybody here from Los Angeles, in Ohio, from California? But we have 3 launch markets. So we've got in the U.S. Dallas and Los Angeles, and the third is Melbourne, Australia. And we're starting this process now of really thinking about community engagement, even though, we're a number of years from a launch, and we're, kind of optimistically at saying 2023. We'll see, how things evolve with the vehicle testing and certification process. But in LA in particular, there's a lot of, I think in just an announcement that you're coming, this is a launch city, I think, and Dallas too. What does that mean for me? So we're getting it from both the city planning and elected officials, but also from the airports in LA and Dallas, right? Because DFW has to start thinking about where we're going to land on their airport. How is it? We know we can accommodate, the early scaled activity at the airport, but what does it look like longer term to make sure we're not affecting the long-term efficiency of the airport? So there's lots of things to think about. I think it's educating city planners, municipal planners about low-altitude airspace and some of the concepts that we heard about earlier with UTM, and how does UTM integrate with the traditional ATC systems when you're getting into airport airspace. So I think there are there's lots of education ahead. I guess I think that's the most important thing, is being really transparent, working collaboratively. I don't think, we are going to rely on municipalities to permit facilities, whatever they may be, but whether they're existing heliport facilities that we're altering, or new types of landing areas like atop of a convention center, for instance. We need to really work closely with those agencies and partner with them. So it's not Uber wants to come in and do this. It's not the same type of disruption, I think, that folks think of with Uber. I think if we go in with this sort of mindset that we're going to do this and we're going to disrupt, we're going to have the zoning hammer of the local communities come down really hard on us, and we obviously don't want that. That will inhibit kind of our vision for the future. So it's really going to be a collaboration.
Yeah, I would just chime in. A few years ago, I was spending time in the area of new mobility, and this was the time of the bikes and the scooters, and there were some that did it right and some that didn't do it right. And in the end, the cities do need to be prepared and understand what is coming and what the trends are. And in my, again, dealing with some of the public sector agencies, there are behavioral resistances to new technologies quite often, because they have their planning models and they've done it this way for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So it is breaking through and finding the right individuals now. And what I see happening is students from universities are being brought in. So I think the collaboration between the university and the city agencies and state agencies is highly important. So you get that new wave of people who understand the technology and understand the new policies. And also just putting someone in charge. Call them the head of new mobility. So you have a lot of new titles that are being brought in to the agencies. There you go, the CIO, yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing insights. We could keep talking. Please keep talking to them off the stage. Thank you for your time, and I'll pass it off to George.